Growing up, you hear a lot of strange things about particular historical figures. Forgive me, YouTube, for I know not what I do. In the name of the subscribe button, the notification bell, and the holy algorithm, amen. So yes, if you were one of those history nerd kids like me growing up, you probably heard at some point that Hitler was secretly Jewish. Now, it's been so long since I first heard this that I can't for the life of me remember where I would have first heard it from. It could have been from some kid on the playground, something on TV, or even a teacher. It was one of those little fun facts that attaches itself to the back of your mind, and whenever you hear about the anti-Semitism of Nazi Germany or the Holocaust, you would think,
ironic.
But here's the thing though, it's not true, at all. There's no evidence for it, none whatsoever. So here are the questions I want to answer in this video. Why is it not true? Where did this myth come from? And why have some people been so obsessed with it? Before we move on with the rest of the video, I want to take a quick moment to plug my Patreon. Now I'm certain most of you know what it is, but for those who don't, Patreon is a crowdfunding platform that helps connect creators making stuff with people who want to financially support them. But instead of giving them one big lump sum, you support these creators with small monthly contributions, with as little as $1 and no maximum if you're so inclined. Every dollar I earn on Patreon makes me less dependent upon the algorithm, AdSense, and sponsors, which will allow me to put more focus into making videos about interesting subjects that you're not going to see on TV, in a classroom, or even from other history tubers. People who join the Casual Historian Patreon can get a number of perks, such as getting to see videos early, getting their names in the end credits of videos, or even commissioning a video on a subject of your choosing. And all patrons get access to an exclusive Discord server, where I talk with members about upcoming projects. If any of this is of interest to you, or you just want to help me make more and better videos, then go ahead and check out patreon.com/casualhistorian. But for now, back to the video. The basis for the myth that Hitler was secretly Jewish goes back to the identity of his paternal grandfather. Adolf Hitler's dad, Alois, was born in 1837 to an Austrian peasant woman, Maria Schicklgruber. But here's the problem. He was born out of wedlock, and Maria refused to tell anyone who the father was. This is the factual root of most of the conspiracy theories you've heard. On Alois's baptismal certificate, it originally said illegitimate in place of the father's name. Back in that time and place, it wouldn't have been uncommon at all to accuse a woman who had a child out of wedlock of having relations with a Jew, especially if you were keeping the paternity quiet. I mean, why else would you not tell anybody? The way the story is usually told is that Maria was employed as a cook or maid by a Jewish man in Graz, Austria, a Leopold Frankenberger, and that she was impregnated by his son. Now, if you're familiar with how Jewish ethnicity is passed down, you've probably heard that it is passed down from mother to child. So even if Maria Schicklgruber did have a son out of wedlock with a Jewish man, Jews would not recognize that child as being born ethnically Jewish, though they could become Jewish by conversion. However, there are other strains of Judaism that have different standards for what qualifies someone as Jewish. But none of those reasons matter in this context, because by the standards of the Nazis, having a single Jewish grandparent is enough to permanently taint your blood, which is what fascinates people about this myth, but we'll get to that later. There are numerous problems with this story though. Firstly, were there even any Jews living in Graz at this time? This might sound kind of weird, but in Central Europe at this time, it wasn't uncommon for local governments to have banned Jews from living in their jurisdictions at some point in the previous centuries. And many of them didn't lift these bans until the latter half of the 19th century, such as Graz, whose city council lifted the ban in 1861, over 20 years after Alois was born. When this myth first came out, an Austrian historian who studied in Graz, Nikolaus von Proradovich, was the first to point this out, and for most historians, this was enough to debunk the conspiracy. But doubt was thrown on this in 2019, when American psychologist and physician Dr. Leonard Sachs published a paper in the Journal of European Studies, Aus den Gemeinden von Burgenland, revisiting the question of Adolf Hitler's paternal grandfather. In his research, he discovered evidence that there were Jews living in Graz prior to 1861, and that the lifting of the ban was more about authorizing a process already in progress than a sudden urge for liberalization. In that same study, Dr. Sachs also presents fairly substantial evidence that Proradovich was a Nazi sympathizer, having served with the Croatian fascists in World War II. His work definitely gives more credence to the conspiracy, but it falls short of proving Hitler's grandfather was Jewish. Firstly, just because there might have been Jews living in Graz in the 1830s around the time Alois would have been conceived and born, does not mean that one of them was his grandfather. It makes it slightly more probable that one of them could have been, but it doesn't actually prove it. Secondly, it fails to prove this conspiracy because it doesn't even prove that someone by the name of Leopold Frankenberger even existed. In fact, in Graz, Austria, there was no family by that name, Jewish or German. There was a Leopold Frank-Reiter living in Graz at that time, but he wasn't Jewish. And on top of that, his son was only 10 years old at the time that Alois would have been born. And his mother, Maria Schicklgruber, was 42, making all of this sound implausible on the face of it. But third and most importantly, there is no evidence that Maria Schicklgruber ever worked or lived in Graz, Austria at any point in her life, and no source claims she did that's dated to prior to 1946. So then, if it was neither a Frankenberger or a Frank-Reiter who fathered Alois, who did? Most historians accept Johann Georg Hiedler as Hitler's paternal grandfather. Johann Georg married Maria Schicklgruber in 1842, 5 years after Alois' birth. Maria died in 1847, and Johann Georg died in 1857, at which point his brother, Johann Nepomuk Hiedler, took Alois in. At some point over the following 20 years, Alois was told by Nepomuk that Georg was his biological father, and that Maria had lied to protect him. So in 1876, Alois officially changed his surname from Schicklgruber to Hiedler, and at some point before Adolf was born, he started spelling his surname as Hitler, which would have been a fairly normal thing at the time. In fact, Hiedler itself was an alternate spelling of the name Heuter. So when it comes to documentary evidence, there is no proof that Hitler was Jewish. But I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, what about DNA testing? Well, there are a few problems with that route. Firstly, where are you going to find a sample of Hitler's DNA? After he killed himself in the bunker during the Battle of Berlin, his body was cremated, leaving only bones behind, which were found by the Soviets and secreted away to Moscow, where they remain to this day. And they have not been willing to let any outsiders examine the remains. Now, this has contributed to other conspiracies about the post-war fate of Hitler, but that's a story for another time. Because of this, we have no way of testing Hitler's DNA to see what his genetics might reveal at all. The closest you could get is one of his relatives, and they are reluctant to enter the public spotlight. Well, back in 2010, a story started making its way around the internet claiming that a DNA test had shown that Hitler had both Jewish and African DNA. Jean-Paul Mulders, a writer for the Flemish magazine Knock, and Mark Vermeuren, a customs official who for some reason keeps getting called a historian in all the articles despite not actually being one, claimed to have tracked down 39 living relatives of Hitler and acquired DNA samples to test. In these tests, they claim they found evidence of haplogroup E1b1b, which is supposed to be super common in both Ashkenazi Jews and those of North African descent. Well, as I was digging through this story, I was trying to find the actual source of it. I found a page on Knack, the magazine Mulders worked for, about the story, but it didn't have any links to medical or scientific publications. Instead, it just mentioned that one of its journalists had one conducted. Most of the English language sites that ran the story didn't cite any sources either. The few that did only cited the existence of the story on another site. The deepest I got was on The Guardian, which links to the oldest version of the story I could find, which was on the Spanish language news site El Mundo. This was the first time I saw Vermeeren referred to as a customs official rather than a historian. And the details they give about the story of them acquiring the DNA samples are, as one of the publications put it, unethical. The story is that they tracked down a trio of brothers living in rural upstate New York. These three brothers have been reported on before, but allegedly they had made a pact to not have children or anything in order to kill off the Hitler bloodline. Well, the two of them claim that they followed these brothers around until they found one brother at a fast food place toss out a greasy napkin out his window, to which point they go pick up the napkin and allegedly use that as the DNA sample. Needless to say, that's kind of yikes. And unethical is, it's the friendliest word you can use to describe their means of acquiring DNA. Stalking's another one. They also claim to have tracked down 36 other relatives living in Austria, most of whom they claim were unaware they were related to Adolf Hitler. None of them had the last name Hitler, but they did have derivations of the German name Heuter. They took the DNA to get tested and came back with the results that got shared with El Mundo. So let's go over some of the problems in this story. Aside from the unethical acquisition of DNA samples, The conclusions reached by Mulders, Vermeeren, and many of the media sources are also a problem. Firstly, DNA sequencing is something of a flawed science, and it was more so back in 2010 when the story was first reported. It's not completely unreliable, but coming to conclusions like they must be X because of the presence of this haplogroup is bad science. Now yes, the E1B1B haplogroup is fairly common amongst those of Ashkenazi and North African descent, but it's also found in other populations as well, so assuming it must mean Jews and Africans seems to be motivated reasoning, considering the subject matter. Another glaring flaw is that none of these DNA samples came from Hitler himself. The one from Alois Jr.'s descendants in America are related to Hitler, but let's not forget that there have been a few generations of admixture from other families. Alois Jr. had a different mother than Adolf, and he married a different woman than Hitler, and his son married a different woman, and so on. So for all we know, the presence of this haplogroup could have come from these guys' mothers or grandmothers rather than Alois. There's also a problem in assuming that these 36 other people they tracked down in Austria are related to Hitler just because they have an etymologically related surname. And you can add the same external admixture problem to their DNA test results as well. One article I read claimed that Vermeeren and Mulders had acquired a secret sample of Hitler's DNA that they kept in a metal briefcase that they tested the other 39 samples against, but no other story reported on this fact, and I haven't found it anywhere, including in the El Mundo article. The cherry on top of this crap Sunday of a story is that none of these media reportings have any access to this study allegedly conducted by this pair of Belgians. Mulders and Vermeeren have never published any scientific study about it and have never revealed who they got to conduct it. The only thing El Mundo and any of the other publications had to go on was their word, which there's no evidence for. So this I'm going to take as utter bullshit. Literal fake news. Okay then, well now that this conspiracy theory has been thoroughly debunked, let's move on to the next question of, where the hell did it come from? Rumors about Hitler being secretly Jewish came up twice, once during his lifetime and once after his death. The first time was back in the 1920s. Whenever we look at this time period, we tend to be obsessed with tracking the rise of the Nazi Party, but what most casual viewers of the period don't realize is that the Nazi Party wasn't saying anything original. There were over 70 different political parties in Germany that emerged late in World War I or right after, saying the same things as the Nazis, and at least 15 of them were in Bavaria, where the Nazis were headquartered. And they were all going after the same group of working class Germans as well. And so it wouldn't have been uncommon at all for one group to lob an accusation of the leaders of the other that they're secretly Jewish in order to hopes of breaking up that group and taking up some of their members. And to your average working class German in the early 1920s, the early Nazis and the communists sounded pretty similar. They were both anti-capitalist and they were both anti-Semitic. The rumor at this time was that Adolf Hitler's surname, Hitler, was actually Jewish. The accusers claimed that the name Heuter, from which the names Hiedler and Hitler are derived, was etymologically Jewish. It's not, by the way, but Adolf's numerous political rivals were throwing everything against the wall to see what stuck. And, well, none of it did. And unfortunately, we don't know who first started this rumor. But at the beginning of this video, I was talking about the paternity of Adolf's father, Alois Hitler. And it's this version of the conspiracy that most people are familiar with, and it's the one with the greatest longevity. This one originates in the mind of Hans Frank, the Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland during World War II. Frank was one of many Nazis put on trial for crimes against humanity at Nuremberg in 1946. After his conviction, he spent his remaining time writing up a memoir, Im Angesicht des Galgens, In the Face of the Gallows. Prior to Hitler's ascent to power in 1933, Hans Frank had been the personal lawyer of Hitler and the Nazi Party, spending much of his time in court defending SA thugs. In his memoir, Frank claims that in 1930, Hitler had received a letter from his nephew, William Patrick Hitler, threatening to blackmail him with evidence about his ancestry. In response to this, Hitler asks Frank to investigate his ancestry in order to put this rumor to bed. Frank claims his investigation uncovers Maria Schicklgruber's employment in Graz, along with a series of correspondence between Leopold Frankenberger and Maria, in which he promises to pay child support in exchange for her silence. The first big problem with this story is that there is zero evidence of these letters of correspondence ever existing. No one has ever seen these letters before. There's no evidence of any illicit payments being made to Maria Schicklgruber either, and of course, as we covered earlier, there is no evidence of someone by the name of Leopold Frankenberger ever living in Graz. along with Maria Schicklgruber having never lived or worked in Graz. There's also just the general unreliability of Hans Frank's memoir. It was published in 1953, 7 years after his execution, and historians coned over it when it was published, and they found numerous other falsehoods in his memoirs. And so, if those parts of the book, the verifiable parts, are not true, then why would this other part be considered true when the rest of it was unreliable as well? Especially when it's based on a set of documents that no one else has ever seen. On top of this, there is the character of Hans Frank. Frank and Hitler had a falling out towards the end of the war, and Frank was angry at Hitler for having led him and everyone else down the failing path. Frank's son, Nicholas Frank, published his own memoir, In the Shadow of the Reich, in which he describes his father as a cowardly, craven liar, who wanted some posthumous revenge against Hitler. Hans Frank hoped to receive credit for providing the key to unlocking Hitler's psyche. And this leads us into question 3. Why have people been so obsessed with this theory and Hitler's ancestry in general? The Holocaust is an event so horrific that we are still trying to grapple with it. To do something so heinous just because you hate a group of people seems a bit overboard. There must be some other reason. Dedicating all of these resources to the eradication of a group of humans seems illogical. So why? Hitler being secretly Jewish provides some people with an explanation. Someone raised in such an anti-Semitic environment, confronted with the possibility of their own Semitic heritage, might go out of their way to prove to everyone that they aren't. Like a closeted, self-hating homosexual man hooking up with tons of random women to prove he isn't gay. But that's not it. Hitler was not the first to try and wipe out the Jews. He was just the first to try it with the modern marvels of industry. The same tools that have made this modern world so fabulously wealthy being used for genocide. Hitler's anti-Semitism wasn't that unusual, and during his rise to power, he wasn't saying anything that hadn't been said before. He was just better at delivering the message at the time. And many of these same attitudes toward the Jews are still around today, but all too often we disregard it as something else. He's just an edgelord, or she's just an anti-Zionist. That kind of hate really does exist, and for some, the only thing separating them from people like Hitler are the means to carry it out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.